Bak Ji-hoo did not raise his voice. He never had to. He simply set his spoon down beside the untouched bowl of soup, and the sound of metal against porcelain was louder than any scream could have been. The kitchen staff froze. The chef, a man who had trained under two Michelin-starred masters in Paris, felt his knees go soft. Two guards in black suits stepped forward without being told, lifted the man by his elbows and walked him out through the side door of the mansion, like he weighed nothing at all. That made 17. 17 chefs in 2 months, each one convinced they had finally cracked the code of a man who tasted nothing, felt nothing, and wanted everyone around him to know it. Before we go further, you need to understand something. This isn't just a story about a cold mafia boss and the chefs who couldn't please him. This is a story about a woman from Texas who was about to walk into that mansion with a cast iron skillet, a grandmother's recipe book, and absolutely no idea what she was getting herself into. Stay with me to the end, because what happens between them is going to make you laugh, make you cry, and maybe make you believe in love again. If you're the kind of person who lives for slow burn romance, bad boy energy wrapped around a broken heart, and the kind of cultural collision that turns into something beautiful, do me a favor and hit that like button now and subscribe before the story really gets going. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Baek Ji-hoo was 29 years old and had inherited more power than most men could carry in 3 lifetimes. His father, Chairman Baek Sung-won, ran one of the most feared organizations in Seoul, a network so deep it touched shipping ports, construction contracts, nightclubs, and half the politicians who pretended they didn't know his name. Ji-hoo had been groomed since he was a boy to take over, trained in negotiation, trained in violence when negotiation failed, trained to keep his face still no matter what the room demanded of him. He was good at his job. He was, by every measure that mattered to his father, a success. But there was a hole in him shaped exactly like his mother. She had died when he was 11, not from illness, not from old age, but from a car that had been tampered with by a rival family trying to send a message to his father. The message had been received. The war that followed left 3 men dead and put Ji-hoo's father in a hospital bed for 6 weeks. But none of that mattered to an 11-year-old boy who only knew that his mother used to hum old trot songs while she cooked, used to sneak him extra pieces of galbi when his father wasn't looking, used to press her palm against his forehead and tell him that no matter how big he grew, he would always be her boy. After she died, food stopped tasting like anything. He ate because his body demanded it, not because he wanted it. Chefs came and went, each one baffled by a young master who could eat the finest hanwoo beef in the country and describe it as though he was chewing on paper. That was the wound underneath the cold. Nobody in the mansion knew it except Oh Min-suk, his head of security, and, if anyone had bothered to ask, his only real friend. Min-suk was built like a refrigerator and had the face of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. But underneath all that muscle was a heart that worried about Ji-hoo the way an older brother worries about a sibling who refuses to admit he's struggling. On the night the 17th chef was escorted out, Min-suk found Ji-hoo standing on the balcony overlooking the Han River. Jacket off, tie loosened, staring at nothing. "You know we're going to run out of chefs in this city eventually. Then we'll import them." "From where?" "The moon." "Nobody wants this job anymore, boss." Words gotten around. Ji-hoo didn't answer. He just kept staring at the water like it owed him something. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Houston, Texas, a woman named Becky Jordan was standing in her kitchen at 11 at night, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a pot of red beans that had gone cold 2 hours ago because she'd forgotten about them. Again, because her mind was somewhere else entirely. Becky was 26, tall, with locks pulled up into a bun that had long since given up on looking neat, and hands that had been cooking since she was 6 years old, standing on a step stool next to her grandmother. Miss Odessa had raised her after Becky's parents split when she was a baby, and everything Becky knew about love, she'd learned in that kitchen. Butter beans simmering low and slow. Cornbread that had to be made in a cast iron skillet, or it wasn't worth making at all. The rule that you never ever let a guest leave your home hungry, because feeding someone was the closest thing to telling them you loved them without having to say the words out loud. Becky had gone to culinary school on scholarships and grit, worked her way up from dishwasher to line cook to sous chef at a restaurant downtown that had, just that morning, told her they were closing due to the building being sold. Just like that. 6 years of her life gone, along with the paycheck she needed to keep her grandmother's medication covered. She was scrolling through job listings with the kind of desperation that makes a person consider things they normally wouldn't when she saw it. A private listing posted through an international culinary placement agency. Personal chef needed for high-profile private residence. Seoul, South Korea. Salary listed in a number that made her sit up straight for the first time in hours. Housing included. Immediate start. No other details. Her best friend Denise, who was sitting on the couch painting her nails and only half listening, looked over Becky's shoulder at the screen. Korea? Girl, you don't even like sushi. That's Japanese, Denise. I know that. I'm testing you. You gonna apply? Becky looked at the number again, looked at the stack of bills, looked at the picture of her grandmother taped to the fridge. The one from Easter Sunday, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing a hat the size of a satellite dish. I already applied 20 minutes ago. She didn't hear back for 3 days. When she did, it wasn't an email. It was a phone call from a man with a thick accent and a voice like gravel, telling her a flight had already been booked for her. First class, leaving in 72 hours. Becky asked what kind of household needed a chef bad enough to fly her out that fast without so much as an interview. The kind that pays well and doesn't like to wait, the voice said. Pack light. Everything else will be provided. She should have asked more questions. She would think that later, many times, usually right before something happened that made her laugh or cry, or both at once. But at the time, all she could think about was her grandmother's medicine, the rent that was 3 weeks overdue, and the fact that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. If you're wondering how a Texas girl who's never left the country in her life is about to end up cooking for one of the most dangerous men in Seoul, buckle up because the culture shock alone is worth the watch. And if you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from because I want to know how many countries are rooting for Becky before this story's even halfway done. The flight was 14 hours long, and Becky spent half of it convinced she'd made a terrible mistake and the other half practicing the 3 Korean phrases she'd memorized off a video the night before. When she landed at Incheon, jet-lagged and disoriented, dragging a suitcase that was one broken zipper away from disaster, she was met by a driver holding a sign with her name spelled wrong. Becky Joden. She almost walked right past it. The driver didn't speak much English. Becky didn't speak much Korean. The car ride to the mansion happened in near silence, except for Becky occasionally saying things out loud just to hear a voice, including a long one-sided conversation with the driver about how she'd never seen mountains that green in her whole entire life. When the car pulled through iron gates and up a driveway lined with manicured trees, Becky pressed her face nearly against the window like a kid at a candy store. The house wasn't a house. It was closer to a compound, all glass and dark stone, with men in black suits stationed at intervals like they were guarding a museum instead of a home. She was met at the door by Oh Min-suk, who took one look at her suitcase, her wide eyes, and her Texas twang, and knew immediately this was going to be interesting. You're the new chef. That's what they tell me. You the welcome wagon? Something like that. Follow me. And a piece of advice free of charge. Don't ask too many questions your first week. Why not? Because the answers might scare you off, and frankly, we need someone to stick around. Becky laughed, thinking he was joking. He was not. She was given a room bigger than her entire apartment back home, shown a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant, all imported marble counters, and a range with more knobs than her car had buttons, and told that dinner needed to be ready by 7. Nobody told her who dinner was for. Nobody told her anything, really, and Becky, running on adrenaline and jet lag, decided the best thing to do was cook the way she always cooked. Big, bold, from the heart. She made smothered oxtails, slow braised until the meat fell off the bone, collard greens with smoked turkey instead of the pork her grandmother would have used, since she didn't know the house's preferences yet, and cornbread made from scratch in the only cast-iron skillet she'd packed in her suitcase, wrapped in 3 layers of clothes to keep it from cracking on the flight. It was the only piece of her grandmother's kitchen she'd been able to bring with her, and she wasn't about to leave it behind. At exactly 7, she was told to plate everything and bring it herself to the private dining room. Nobody had explained that this was unusual. Nobody had explained a lot of things. When she walked in, she saw a man sitting alone at a long table, dressed like he'd stepped out of a magazine, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, eyes that looked like they hadn't smiled in a decade. He didn't look up when she entered. She set the plate down in front of him without a word, because at this point she'd learned that was the custom, and stepped back to wait, the way she'd been instructed. He looked at the plate for a long moment. Oxtails, collard greens, cornbread. Not a single item on it resembled anything he'd been served in his entire life. What is this? Dinner. I can see that. What is it? Smothered oxtails, collard greens, and cornbread. It's called soul food where I'm from. And where is that? Texas. He picked up his fork like it personally owed him an apology, tasted a small bite of the oxtail, chewed slowly, and set the fork down. It's too heavy. Becky blinked. Excuse me. Too heavy. Too much salt. This isn't refined. Sir, with all due respect, I didn't fly 14 hours to make you something refined. I made you something good. The room went very still. Somewhere behind her, she heard what sounded suspiciously like a laugh being swallowed whole. Jihu looked up at her properly for the first time, and something flickered across his face that hadn't been there in a long time. Surprise. Nobody in this house talks to me like that. Well, maybe that's part of the problem. She picked up the plate, untouched except for that single bite, and walked out of the dining room with her chin up and her heart hammering, absolutely certain she'd just gotten herself fired and deported on her very first night. In the hallway, Min-suk was leaning against the wall, trying not to laugh so hard he'd cry. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the dumbest. Ain't decided yet myself. Jihu did not fire her that night. He didn't say anything at all, which, as Min-suk later explained, was somehow worse and better at the same time, because it meant he was thinking about it. And Beck Jihu thinking about something was rare enough to be worth noting. Over the next week, Becky settled in the way anyone settles into a place that's foreign in every sense of the word. She got lost in the house twice. She accidentally set off a silent alarm trying to find the pantry at 2 in the morning and had 4 guards burst into the kitchen ready for a fight, only to find her standing there in pajamas, holding a bag of rice like a hostage. She learned the names of the staff, learned a handful more Korean phrases, mostly food-related, and learned that Min-suk, despite his intimidating size, was the closest thing this house had to comic relief. Always ready with a joke or a story about Jihu as a kid that he probably wasn't supposed to be sharing. He used to be scared of the dark, 9 years old and still needed a light on in the hallway. You better not be telling her that. I absolutely am telling her that. Becky started noticing things about Jihu the way you notice weather changing, slowly, then all at once. The way he ate everything with the same blank expression, like his taste buds had been switched off at some point and nobody had ever bothered to switch them back on. The way he watched the staff without ever really looking at them, like he was present in the house but not really living in it. The way his shoulders sat too high, like they were braced for a hit that never came, but that he was always expecting anyway. She decided against every warning bell in her head telling her to keep her nose out of it, that she was going to figure out how to make this man taste something again. Her second attempt wasn't soul food this time. She'd spent an afternoon in the kitchen with the house's Korean cook, an older woman named Ajuma Hyejin, who barely spoke English, but communicated perfectly well through gestures, taste testing, and the universal language of 2 women who took food very seriously. Becky learned about doenjang, about gochujang, about the specific way rice needed to be rinsed exactly 6 times, no more, no less. And that night she made something new. Braised short ribs in a sauce that blended gochujang with a touch of molasses and brown sugar, the way her grandmother made her barbecue sauce. Served over rice with a side of collard greens simmered in doenjang instead of turkey stock, and cornbread with a hint of sesame oil brushed on top before it went in the oven. She set the plate down in front of him and stepped back, waiting, heart in her throat, even though she told herself she didn't care what he thought. Jihu looked at the plate for a long time before he picked up his chopsticks. He took a bite, chewed, Something happened behind his eyes that Becky couldn't name at first, and then she realized what it was. It was memory. It was the exact expression of a man being pulled backward in time against his will. His mother used to make something similar. Not identical, nothing was ever identical, but close enough in spirit that his chest tightened before he could stop it. The sweetness under the spice, the way the rice soaked up the sauce. He set his chopsticks down and, for the first time in front of any staff member in 18 years, he had to look away and collect himself before speaking. Where did you learn to make this? Nowhere, really. Just tried something. He didn't say it was good. He didn't need to. He ate the entire plate, every bite, and when he was finished, he looked at her and said something that surprised them both equally. Make it again tomorrow. That was the beginning, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the house. Meals stopped being a formality Ji-hoo endured and started being something he actually showed up for on time, which the entire staff noticed and nobody dared comment on out loud, at least not where he could hear. Becky started experimenting more, blending her grandmother's recipes with what she was learning about Korean flavors, and every new dish felt like handing Ji-hoo a small piece of a language he'd forgotten how to speak. There were fights, because of course there were. Becky was stubborn as a Texas summer, and Ji-hoo had never in his life had someone tell him no. And the first few times she refused to change a recipe just because he demanded it. The kitchen practically vibrated with tension. You can't just tell me it's too spicy and expect me to make it bland. That defeats the whole purpose. I'm the one eating it, and I'm the one cooking it, so we're both going to have to compromise, which I know is a foreign concept to a man who's used to people jumping every time he lifts a finger. Min-suk, standing in the doorway, pretending to check his phone, nearly choked trying not to laugh. Ji-hoo stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Nobody talked to him that way. Nobody except, apparently, a 5'9" chef from Texas who looked at him like he was just a man instead of a name. People whispered in fear across the city. And somehow, that was exactly what he needed. There was a night, about a month in, when Becky found him on the same balcony overlooking the Han River, alone, the way Min-suk had found him that first night before she'd ever arrived. She almost turned back around, figuring it wasn't her place, but something in the slump of his shoulders made her stop. You always stand out here when something's bothering you? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. My mother used to love this view. She said the river looked like it was made of glass at night. Becky came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, not close enough to make it strange. She sounds like she was somebody special. She was. What happened to her, if you don't mind me asking? He told her, all of it. The car, the rival family, the 11-year-old boy who stopped tasting food because grief had shut off some part of him he didn't know how to turn back on. Becky listened without interrupting, without offering empty comfort, just standing there letting him talk in a way he clearly hadn't let himself do in years. When he finished, she reached over and took his hand, just held it, nothing more.
That's why my cooking got to you. Not because it was fancy. Because somewhere in there, it reminded you what it feels like to be loved by somebody who's cooking just for you. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Baek Ji-hoo smiled. Not a smirk, not the cold half-twitch of a man being polite. A real smile, small and unpracticed, like a muscle he hadn't used in a long time. If you're rooting for these two, and I know you are, comment the word soul below so I know you're still with me, because we are just getting started and things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. Complicated arrived 2 days later, in the form of a black car pulling through the front gate at an hour when no one was expected. Becky was in the kitchen prepping vegetables when Min-suk burst in, all traces of his usual humor wiped clean off his face. Chairman's here. Ji-hoo's father. I take it, judging by how everybody just turned into statues. Chairman Baek Sung-won was a shorter man than his son, but carried himself like he took up twice the space, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made even hardened guards straighten their spines when he walked past. He'd come, as it turned out, to discuss a merger, business jargon that Becky quickly realized was code for a marriage arrangement, because trailing one step behind him was a young woman dressed in designer clothes with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name was Song Ariam, daughter of a business partner whose company controlled a significant portion of shipping routes the Bake family relied on. She was beautiful in the sharp, curated way of someone who had never once left the house without checking a mirror first, and she looked at Becky, standing there in an apron with flour on her hands, like she'd found something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "You must be the help. I'm the chef. There's a difference." "Is there?" Ji-hoo, summoned to greet his father, arrived just in time to see the exchange, and something in his jaw tightened in a way Becky had learned meant he was annoyed, though he said nothing in the moment. Chairman Sung-won clapped a hand on his son's shoulder, with the forced warmth of a man performing affection rather than feeling it. "Ariam's father and I have been talking. It's time you settled down, Ji-hoo. A union between our families would strengthen everything we've built." "I don't recall agreeing to that conversation." "You don't need to agree, you need to be smart." The dinner that followed was the most uncomfortable meal Becky had ever cooked. She'd prepared something elegant for the occasion, a Korean beef course with a subtle Texas influence in the smoked paprika rub, but Song Ariam picked at her plate the entire time, making pointed comments about how unusual it was for a Bake family dinner to be catered by someone so unrefined, throwing not-so-subtle glances at Becky every time she came in to clear a dish. Later that night, after the guests had left, Becky found Ji-hoo in his study, tie loosened, a glass of untouched whiskey sitting in front of him. "You gonna marry her?" "No." "Your daddy seemed pretty set on it." "My father is set on a lot of things. Doesn't mean they happen." Becky leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, trying to sound more casual than she felt. "Not that it's any of my business." "It's not." Checking. He looked up at her then, and there was something raw in his expression, something he usually kept locked behind that cold mask. "I'm not marrying Song Ariam. I don't feel anything for her. I feel more sitting across from you eating cornbread than I've felt in 18 years, and that terrifies me more than any rival family ever has." Becky's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to just say it, out loud, plain as day, the way Texas people said things when they finally got tired of dancing around them. "Well," she said, crossing the room slowly, "for what it's worth, I feel something too. And it scares me plenty as well, seeing as I'm 8,000 miles from home and falling for a man whose job description apparently includes owning a house full of armed guards." "Is that a complaint?" "Just an observation." He stood, closing the distance between them, and for a moment they just stood there, close enough to feel the warmth coming off each other, close enough that Becky's heart was pounding loud enough she was sure he could hear it. "Can I kiss you? You gonna ask permission every time? Or just this once?" He laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in that house that somewhere down the hall, Min-suk, walking past with a clipboard, stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the closed study door like it had grown wings. The kiss, when it happened, was soft at first, then not so soft, the kind of kiss that had been building for weeks without either of them fully admitting it. When they finally broke apart, Becky pressed her forehead against his chest and laughed a little, breathless. "My grandmother is going to have a field day when I tell her I fell in love with a Korean Mafia boss." "Wait until she hears the Mafia part." "Oh, I heard about that a while back." Min-suk's terrible at keeping secrets, by the way. "If you thought that was sweet, just wait, because every good romance needs a storm to test it, and this one's about to get loud. If you haven't already, hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next, because I promise you it's a roller coaster from here on out." The storm arrived 3 weeks later, and it arrived with Gunfire. Becky had grown comfortable enough in the house by then to stop flinching every time she saw a guard's holster, comfortable enough to joke with Min-suk about American football versus whatever the guards were always watching on the break room television, comfortable enough to believe, foolishly, that the danger of Ji-hoo's world was something that lived at the edges, something that would never actually touch her directly. She was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday evening while she was walking back from the greenhouse where the estate grew its own herbs, arms full of fresh basil and mint for that night's dinner. A car she didn't recognize came screeching through a side gate that should have been locked, and before she could process what was happening, there were shouts. And then there was the unmistakable crack of gunfire splitting the evening air. She dropped to the ground on instinct, herbs scattering everywhere, heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. Guards swarmed the courtyard. She heard Ji-hoo's voice, sharper and more commanding than she'd ever heard it, shouting orders. And through the chaos she saw him running toward her, not toward safety, toward her, and something in her chest cracked open at the sight of it. He reached her just as the gunfire stopped, the intruder's car reversing hard and speeding back out the gate they'd come through, chased by 3 of his men. He dropped to his knees in front of her, hands on her face, checking her over frantically. Are you hit? Are you hurt? Look at me. Are you hurt? I'm fine. I'm fine. I dropped the basil. It was such a ridiculous thing to say in the middle of an assassination attempt that they both nearly laughed. The kind of laugh that comes right before you fall apart, and then Ji-hoo was pulling her into his chest so tightly it almost hurt, his whole body shaking in a way she'd never seen from him. I'm sorry. This is the world I live in. I should never have let you get this close to it. Don't you dare apologize for something that wasn't your fault. It is my fault. Rival families don't attack randomly. Someone is sending a message, and that message involves you, which means you're not safe here anymore, and I don't know what to do about that, except send you home. Becky pulled back and looked at him, really looked at him. This man who 2 months ago had been a stranger throwing out chefs and sitting alone on balconies, and felt something fierce rise up in her chest, the same stubbornness that had gotten her through culinary school on nothing but scholarships and grit. I didn't come 8,000 miles to run at the first sign of trouble. My grandmother didn't raise a quitter, and neither did whatever raised you, because I've seen you fight for things you care about, so don't you dare tell me to leave when what I care about is standing right in front of me covered in dirt from tackling me to the ground. I'm not covered in dirt. You got a little. Right there. She reached up and brushed a smudge off his cheek, and despite everything, despite the gunfire still ringing in both their ears, he caught her hand and pressed a kiss into her palm, and in that moment, whatever fear either of them had left melted into something steadier. Resolve. The investigation that followed revealed the attack had come from the Choi family, longtime rivals who'd been circling for a weakness to exploit ever since word got around that Ji-hoo's judgment had softened, that a foreign chef had somehow gotten close enough to matter to him. That kind of information, in that world, was currency, and someone inside the Bake organization had sold it. It didn't take long for suspicion to land, unfairly and cruelly, on Becky. The finger got pointed by Song Ariam, who showed up unannounced 2 days after the attack, expressing false concern that barely masked the satisfaction underneath it. I just think it's worth asking how the Choi family knew exactly when to strike, and exactly where Ji-hoo would be. It's strange, don't you think, that it happened right after a foreigner started having so much access to this house. Chairman Sung-won, already uneasy about his son's obvious devotion to a woman who wasn't Korean, wasn't wealthy, and wasn't part of the careful web of alliances he'd spent decades building, seized on the accusation with a speed that told Becky he'd been looking for a reason all along. She's not to leave the estate until this is resolved. Father, that's insane. She has nothing to do with this. She has access to the schedule, the security details, everything. I'm not saying she's guilty. I'm saying we investigate everyone, and that includes her. Becky stood in the middle of that study feeling the ground shift under her feet, watching a man she'd started to think of as almost a father figure, gruff but fair. Look at her now, like she was a liability instead of a person. You really think I'd do that? After everything? I think love makes people foolish, Miss Jordan, and foolishness gets people killed. I'm not willing to bet my son's life on the assumption that you're exactly who you say you are. That night was the hardest one Becky had faced since arriving in Korea. She sat alone in her room, the weight of suspicion pressing down on her, the fear that everything she'd built here, the found family in the kitchen, the friendship with Min-suk, the impossible, wonderful thing growing between her and Ji-hoo, was about to collapse because of a lie dressed up as concern. Ji-hoo came to her that night, furious, in a way she'd never witnessed. Not at her, but on her behalf. I told him it's ridiculous. I told him I trust you completely. And did he listen? He will. I'll make him listen. I'm not losing you over Ariam's jealousy and my father's paranoia. Becky reached for his hand, steadying herself as much as him. Just find out who actually leaked it. Clear my name properly. Don't just make him back down. Make him believe it. Because I don't want to spend the rest of whatever this is with your father looking at me like I'm a spy waiting to strike. The truth, when it surfaced 4 days later, arrived through Min-suk, who had been quietly running his own investigation the entire time, unwilling to believe the woman who'd been sneaking him extra cornbread every week could possibly be a traitor. Found something you both need to see. The security footage, painstakingly recovered from a camera that had supposedly malfunctioned that day, showed Song Ariam herself in the security office 3 days before the attack, alone, on her phone, in a room she had no business being in unsupervised. Further digging into her family's finances revealed the Choi family had recently made a substantial and previously unexplained payment to her father's shipping company, the exact kind of payment that greased the wheels for exactly this sort of information trade. Ariam had orchestrated the whole thing, banking on Becky taking the fall so that with the foreign chef removed and discredited, the path back to an arranged marriage would clear itself. Confronted in front of Chairman Sung-won, Ariam's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. You were never going to choose me anyway. Not with her hanging around, ruining everything. cooking her way into a life that was supposed to be mine. It was never yours to begin with, Ji-hoo said, quiet and final. And you nearly got the woman I love killed because you couldn't stand losing something you never had. The chairman, to his credit, didn't waste time on excuses. He turned to Becky, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something like genuine respect in his expression. I owe you an apology, Miss Jordan. I let suspicion cloud judgment I should have trusted. That won't happen again. I appreciate that. But you should know, apology or not, I'm not going anywhere. Not because of you, and not because of her. Because of him. If you thought the drama was over, hold on. Because we've got one more storm to weather, and this one's the biggest yet. Comment down below if you think Becky's staying for good, and don't forget to like this video if you're as invested in these two as I am, because we are heading straight into the climax. Song Aryum, exposed and humiliated, disappeared from the back estate that same night, and for a few weeks, things settled into something Becky could almost call peace. Chairman Sung-won, in his own stiff and formal way, began treating her less like a threat, and more like someone who belonged, occasionally even requesting her cooking by name. A gesture that Min-suk assured her was the closest thing to a compliment the old man was capable of giving. But peace, in Ji-hoo's world, was always temporary. The Choi family, embarrassed by their failed attack, and now facing the fallout of their exposed alliance with Aryum's father, decided to gamble everything on one final, desperate move. They knew by now exactly what mattered most to Ji-hoo, exactly what had made him vulnerable in a way his enemies had never seen before. And so, on a night when Ji-hoo was called away to handle an urgent matter at one of the family's shipping warehouses, a distraction Becky would later realize had been engineered from the start, 3 men slipped onto the estate grounds through a service entrance and took her. She fought. Texas girls don't go down without a fight. And Becky Jordan had thrown enough elbows working kitchen lines full of grown men who thought a woman couldn't keep up to know how to defend herself in close quarters. She left one man with a broken nose from a cast iron skillet swung with everything she had. The same skillet her grandmother had given her. The one piece of home she'd carried across an ocean, now serving as a weapon in the fight of her life. But 3 against 1 were unfair odds, and eventually they got a bag over her head and forced her into a car. When Ji-hoo returned to the estate and found the kitchen in disarray, the skillet dented on the floor, Becky nowhere to be found, something in him went cold in a way it hadn't been since the day his mother died. But this time, the cold wasn't grief. It was purpose. Find her. I don't care what it costs. Burn every safe house the Choi family owns if you have to, but find her. Min-suk. For once completely serious, nodded without a single joke. We'll find her, boss. And when we do, I want first crack at whoever put their hands on her. The trail led to an abandoned textile warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and Ji-hoo arrived not with an army, though one was assembling behind him, but ahead of it, alone, because every second mattered, and he refused to wait one moment longer than necessary. He found Becky tied to a chair in a dim room, a bruise forming on her cheekbone, chin lifted, glaring at the men guarding her with the kind of defiance that made even hardened criminals uneasy. You know, my grandmother always said the Lord don't like ugly. And kidnapping a woman planning her own Christmas dinner menu is about as ugly as it gets. Shut up. Make me. When Ji-hoo burst through the door, what followed happened fast. The kind of controlled violence he'd been trained for his entire life, precise and merciless, and within minutes the men who'd taken her were on the ground, and Ji-hoo was on his knees in front of her chair, hands shaking as he worked the ropes loose, checking every inch of her for injury with a desperation that stripped away every last trace of the cold mask he'd worn for 18 years. I thought I lost you. I thought I actually lost you. Takes more than a couple of Korean gangsters and a burlap sack to get rid of me. Told you, I'm not a quitter. He pulled her into his arms so tightly it nearly hurt. And Becky felt him shaking against her. This man who commanded fear from an entire city, undone completely by the thought of losing her. I love you. I should have said it before now, but I love you, Becky Jordan, more than I've loved anything since my mother was alive. And I am not spending one more day pretending that isn't true. I love you too, she whispered against his shoulder, tears finally spilling over now that the danger had passed and her body remembered it was allowed to feel things again. Now get me out of here, before I start crying so hard I ruin what's left of my mascara. The fallout from that night rippled through Seoul's underground for months. The Choi family, having overplayed their hand catastrophically, found themselves isolated as former allies scrambled to distance themselves from an organization that had just declared open war on the Beck family by touching someone under Ji-hoo's direct protection. Within weeks, their operations had been dismantled piece by piece, not through more violence, but through the kind of methodical, ruthless business maneuvering that Ji-hoo had been trained his whole life to execute, cutting off supply routes, buying out contracts, isolating them until they had no choice but to fold entirely. Chairman Sung-won watched his son handle the entire affair with something like pride he'd never quite shown before. You handled that better than I would have at your age. I had motivation you didn't have. The chairman glanced toward the kitchen, where Becky's laughter could be heard through the door, teaching Ajuma Hae-jin how to make sweet tea properly, insisting that no amount of Korean tea ceremony tradition was going to convince her that unsweetened tea counted as tea at all. Yes, I suppose you did. 6 months after Becky first stepped off that plane at Incheon, with a suitcase held together by hope and a cast iron skillet wrapped in 3 layers of clothes, Ji-hoo asked her to marry him. He didn't do it with fireworks or a grand public gesture, because by then he understood her well enough to know that wasn't what she wanted. Instead, he asked her in the kitchen, late at night, while she stood at the counter finishing up a pot of gumbo she'd been experimenting with, blending Louisiana spice traditions her grandmother had taught her with Korean seafood the market had gotten in fresh that morning. He didn't get down on one knee with some rehearsed speech. He just stood behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and set a small box on the counter next to the pot. I figured you'd want to finish stirring before you looked at that. Becky turned around, slow, wooden spoon still in hand, sauce dripping onto the floor because her hands had gone still with shock. Beak Ji-hoo. Did you just propose to me while I'm covered in gumbo? Would you rather I waited for a cleaner moment? Because I've learned you don't really do clean moments. She laughed, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and overflowing, and threw her arms around his neck, spoon and all, leaving a small streak of sauce on his crisp white shirt that he didn't seem to mind one bit. Ask me properly. Marry me, Becky Jordan. Stay in this house, stay in this kitchen, stay in this life, because I don't taste anything without you in it anymore, and I never want to find out what that feels like again. Yes. Obviously yes. Now let me finish this gumbo before it burns, because I am not starting my engagement with scorched roux. Chairman Sung-won, when informed the next morning, simply nodded once, poured himself a cup of the sweet tea Becky had left brewing on the counter, took a sip, made a face like he'd swallowed something offensive, and admitted, quietly, that he supposed he could get used to it. Miss Odessa flew out for the wedding 6 months later, took one look at the mansion, the guards, the gardens, and declared to anyone within earshot that her granddaughter had done gone and married into money and danger both, which sounded about right for a Jordan woman, since they'd never once in the family history done anything the easy way. She and Ajuma Hae-jin became fast friends over a shared belief that food was love and anyone who disagreed simply hadn't been fed properly yet, and by the end of the reception the two of them had traded 4 recipes and one very serious argument about the correct way to season greens. Becky Jordan became Becky Bake in a ceremony that blended traditions from both sides of the world, a hanbok for the bowing ceremony, and a white dress for the vows exchanged under string lights in the estate's garden, Min-suk serving as best man and crying harder than anyone expected from a man built like a refrigerator, insisting through his tears that he wasn't crying. Something was just in his eye, twice in both eyes. And Big Ji-hoo, the man who once fired 17 chefs in 2 months because nothing on earth could satisfy a palate numbed by grief, stood at the head of that table every single night for the rest of his life and tasted everything. The bitter, the sweet, the spice of gochujang folded into his mother's memory, the warmth of a Texas kitchen carried across an ocean by a woman brave enough to cross it. He tasted all of it fully, finally, because love, it turns out, is the one flavor no chef can fake, and the one dish that, once you've had it, you never stop craving again. If this story had you feeling all kinds of ways, laughing 1 minute and holding your breath the next, let me know in the comments which part hit you hardest, because I read every single one of them. If you loved Becky and Ji-hoo's story, smash that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next Afro-Korean romance dropping on this channel. Because trust me, this is only the beginning of the stories I've got for you. Thank you for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.